When 29-year-old Megan Davis stood at the gate of millionaire Peter Reed's estate, holding a 4-year-old girl in her arms, she had no idea her desperate plea would change 2 lives forever. Dressed in worn clothes, her hair a mess, and her eyes filled with tears, Megan spoke words that sent a chill down Peter's spine. "Please, sir, could I clean your home in exchange for a plate of food for my daughter?" However, when Peter looked closely at the child's features, his world turned upside down. Her eyes, her smile, the shape of her face, everything was identical, an impossible resemblance, because this child was the spitting image of his own daughter, Emma, who had died 5 years earlier in a tragic accident. Or maybe, just maybe, Emma had never really died at all. The Reed estate stood majestically in the rolling hills of the countryside, surrounded by impeccably manicured gardens that caught the golden light of the evening sky. Peter Reed, 45, one of the wealthiest entrepreneurs in the country with a fortune estimated at $500 million, was in his study when he heard the doorbell ring through the vast, silent mansion. It was a November evening. The chilling wind carried with it the scent of lavender and the crisp mountain air. Peter wasn't expecting any visitors. For the past 5 years, he had lived an almost reclusive existence. After his wife, Frances, and his daughter, Emma, lost their lives in a car accident that had shattered his world, the only people he saw were the housekeeper, who came 3 times a week, and his lawyers for business matters. A second ring of the doorbell made him frown with annoyance. Peter rose from the leather armchair where he was reviewing business files and went to the main entrance. On the video intercom screen, he saw the shadowy figure of a woman holding something in her arms. He assumed it was probably another salesperson or someone asking for donations, but when he opened the door, the sight that greeted him took his breath away. Before him stood a young woman, about 29 years old, with long brown hair tousled by the wind and green eyes filled with despair. She wore faded jeans, a worn red sweatshirt, and tired sneakers. In her arms, she clutched a little 4-year-old girl with blonde, curly hair, whose small face rested, asleep, against her shoulder. The woman was shivering, not just from the cold, but from the fear and humiliation of what she was about to do. When she looked up at Peter, tears began to stream down her smudged cheeks. In a trembling voice, she spoke the words that would change everything. She asked for permission to clean his house in exchange for a meal for her daughter. The little girl hadn't eaten in 2 days. Peter felt a chord strike in his chest, an emotion he had buried for years. But as he looked at the woman begging for his help, the child in her arms began to stir. The little girl lifted her head from her mother's shoulder and stared at Peter with blue eyes still cloudy with sleep. In that precise moment, time stood still. Peter studied the child's face and felt the blood freeze in his veins. Her blue eyes were a reflection of his own. The shape of her face, the small beauty mark on her right cheek, and even the way she tilted her head when she was curious. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. It was like seeing his daughter Emma again at the age of 4. The similarity was so stunning, so exact, that Peter had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling. His heart was pounding so fast he felt like the whole street could hear it. In a trembling voice he asked for the child's name. The answer paralyzed him. Emma. The little girl's name was Emma, just like his late daughter. Peter felt his world crumble. This couldn't be real. His daughter Emma had died 5 years ago. He had identified her body at the morgue, he had arranged her funeral, he had wept over her grave for months, and yet, faced with this child without another word, Peter immediately let them in. As Megan entered the mansion with Emma in her arms, Peter couldn't take his eyes off the little girl. Every one of her movements, every expression, every small gesture, matched the memories he had of his daughter perfectly. It was as if the ghost of his past had just materialized before him. But how was that possible? And who really was this woman claiming to be Emma's mother? Peter led Megan and Emma to the grand living room, where a crackling fire in the fireplace created a warm and comforting atmosphere. The child looked at everything with wide eyes, fascinated by the size of the room and the elegant furniture, while Megan still seemed unable to believe she had been invited inside. While preparing a meal in the kitchen, Peter continued to watch Emma secretly. The child had sat down next to her mother and was playing with a worn-out rag doll, which was likely her only toy. Every gesture she made only confirmed the incredible resemblance to his daughter. He returned to the living room with a tray full of food. Megan gave him an emotional thank you, her eyes filled with tears, while Emma began to eat with the voracity of someone who hadn't had food for several days. Peter invited them to tell him their story. Megan told him she had been a widow for 2 years, after her husband Mark died in a work accident. Since then, she had struggled to get by, working odd jobs and trying to raise Emma on her own. 3 months ago, she had been laid off from her job at a factory and found herself unable to pay her rent. Since then, she had been living in her car or in precarious shelters. But all of Peter's attention remained focused on Emma. The child, having finished her meal, was now looking at the paintings on the wall. When she saw a family photograph of Peter, Francis, and his first Emma, she got up and walked closer. In her small, soft voice, she pointed out that the little girl in the photo looked like her. Megan glanced at the photograph and turned pale. Peter explained that it was his daughter Emma, who had died 5 years earlier along with his wife in a car accident. A heavy silence fell over the room. It was then that Emma did something that sent a shiver down Peter's spine. She called him Daddy with the same inflection, the same gentle tone his own daughter used to use. It was impossible, and yet. Megan quickly grabbed Emma's hand, apologizing and saying the child was just confused. Peter stood up abruptly and went to his office. He needed to check something that might explain the inexplicable. He opened his safe and pulled out a file he hadn't looked at in years, containing all the documents related to the accident 5 years ago. He carefully reread every page, looking for a detail he might have missed. That's when he found an anomaly. In the hospital report, a note had been scribbled in the margin. Identification difficult due to condition of the body. Additional DNA verification required. He had never noticed that note before. As he continued to rummage through the documents, he found another shocking piece of evidence, a request for a DNA test bearing his own signature, but next to it a note read, "Test cancelled at the request of the family," but he had never cancelled any test. He returned to the living room, his hands trembling. Emma had fallen asleep on the sofa, curled up like a little angel, while Megan gently tucked a blanket around her. Peter then asked Megan a crucial question. Did she know anything about Emma's origins? Was she truly her biological mother? Megan's tongue insisted that of course Emma was her daughter, that she had given birth to her at City General Hospital in 2019. Peter sat down next to her and told her he believed they had something to uncover together, a secret someone had been hiding for 5 long years. The next morning Peter woke up at dawn after a sleepless night. He had put Megan and Emma in the guest room but couldn't find any rest himself. He went down to the kitchen and prepared breakfast, something he hadn't done in years. When Emma came in, she ran up to him with a smile and thanked him for letting them stay. Peter crouched down to her level and asked if she had any memories of her early childhood before living with her mommy. The child seemed to think, then shook her head, remembering only her mommy and Daddy Mark. Peter told Megan they needed to go to the City General Hospital. He suspected a mistake had been made, or worse, 5 years ago. He explained his theory. He was convinced that the child he had buried was not Emma, and that their Emma was his daughter, the one he thought was dead. After an hour's drive, they arrived at the hospital. Peter had called ahead to arrange a meeting with Dr. Moreau, the head of pediatrics, who had been on staff 5 years ago. Dr. Moreau welcomed them into his office, looking concerned. When Peter asked him to look closely at Emma, the doctor observed her and turned pale, whispering that it was impossible. The doctor stood up and walked over to a filing cabinet. With trembling hands, he pulled out a medical file and placed it on the desk. What it contained would shatter them all. On the night of the accident, it wasn't just Peter's wife and daughter who were involved. There was another car with a couple and their child on board. The couple died instantly, but their child survived. Megan's biological parents had died in that accident, but she wasn't with them that night, having stayed with her grandparents. Emma had been in the other vehicle, the one with Peter's wife, but a tragic error had occurred during the identification process. The condition of the bodies was such that they had swapped the identities of the 2 children. The child Peter had buried was the daughter from the other family. Emma, his Emma, had survived and had been placed in an orphanage as the survivor from the other family. Shortly after, Megan and her husband Mark had started adoption proceedings. Through a series of administrative coincidences, Emma was entrusted to them under a new identity. No one ever knew about the initial mix-up. Peter looked at Emma, who was staring at him with her innocent blue eyes. His daughter was alive. His daughter had always been alive and had grown up just a few miles away from him without him ever knowing. But Dr. Moreau added that there was something else he needed to know. The mistake had not been entirely accidental. Dr. Moreau closed his office door and sat back down, looking like someone about to reveal a terrible secret. He explained that shortly after the accident he had been visited by an elegant man who introduced himself as the lawyer for Peter's insurance company. The man had credible documents and knew intimate details about the family. He claimed he wanted to spare Peter the trauma of seeing his daughter in such a state. The doctor, young and inexperienced at the time, had believed him. The man had also made a generous donation to the hospital. Shortly after, the same man had returned with more papers, claiming that the surviving child from the other accident needed to be placed with a family quickly, and that he had already found the ideal couple, Megan and Mark. Peter suddenly understood the full extent of the scheme. Someone had orchestrated everything to ensure Emma ended up with Megan and Mark, far away from him. When the doctor described the man, tall in his 50s, with graying hair and a scar on his left hand, Peter recognized him instantly. It was Victor Crane, his former business partner, the man he had fired and reported for embezzlement just before the accident. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Crane had always been jealous of Peter's success and had sworn revenge after being exposed. Dr. Moreau provided more disturbing details. After Emma was placed with Megan's family, Crane had continued to visit the hospital regularly. Once he had overheard him on the phone saying that Peter must never find out the child was alive, that his suffering was the price he had to pay. Peter clenched his fists. Crane hadn't just stolen millions from him, he had stolen 5 years of his daughter's life. 5 years of love, growth, and precious moments that would never come back. Megan, who had been listening to the story in silence, spoke up, saying that Peter needed to think about Emma first. The child needed stability, not revenge. Peter looked at Emma, who had been listening without really understanding the gravity of the events. The child looked at him with her innocent blue eyes and smiled, spontaneously calling him Daddy again. Peter's heart broke and mended in the same instant. His daughter had called him Daddy again, and this time he knew she was truly his. He told her gently that she hadn't done anything wrong, that on the contrary, she had done something wonderful. She had come back to Daddy. But as he held Emma in his arms, Peter knew the battle was just beginning. He had to confront Crane, but first, he had to figure out how to handle the situation with Megan, who had raised Emma as her own daughter for 4 years. The drive back to the estate was filled with tension and silence. Emma slept in the back seat, unaware of the emotional earthquake that had just rocked the lives of the adults around her. Peter drove, his eyes fixed on the road, while Megan stared out the window, tears silently streaming down her cheeks. When they arrived at the estate, Peter carried Emma to the guest room and laid her in bed, giving her a tender kiss on the forehead. For the first time in 5 years, he was saying goodnight to his daughter. The emotion was so overwhelming that he had to leave the room to keep from breaking down. In the living room, Megan sat on the sofa, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. Peter sat across from her, both aware of the difficult conversation that lay ahead. Megan explained that Emma was her whole life, that she had raised her since she was 6 months old, that she was the only family she had left after Mark's death. Peter replied that he understood her pain, but that Emma was his daughter too. He had lost 5 years with her, 5 years during which he had mourned her death and visited an empty grave. Megan counted that she had spent 4 years loving Emma as her own flesh and blood, caring for her when she was sick, comforting her fears, teaching her to walk and talk. Peter stood by the window, looking out at the garden shrouded in darkness. He was facing an impossible dilemma. How could he resolve this situation without destroying Emma? They both loved the same child, both with legitimate but seemingly irreconcilable claims. That's when Peter had an idea. He asked Megan if they really had to choose. Emma needed them both, him because he was her biological father, but also her because she was the only mother she had ever known. He proposed that they form a family, all 3 of them together. It wasn't about marriage, but about living together as a family to raise Emma jointly. Megan had no home and no job, and the estate had more than enough space for everyone. Megan objected at first, saying she couldn't accept his charity, but Peter clarified that it wasn't charity, it was a necessity. Emma needed stability, and the only stable option was to have both of them in her life. Megan thought for a long time, then asked about Crane. They couldn't let his crime go unpunished. Peter would have preferred to take revenge on his former partner personally, but Megan was right. If they didn't stop him, he might try to separate them again, or destroy other families. They agreed they would face Crane together, with Emma safe but present, to show him the consequences of his cruel games. The next day, Peter discovered that Crane was living in a mansion on the outskirts of the city, bought with the money he had stolen from him. That evening, while Emma slept, Peter and Megan prepared for the confrontation that would put an end to Crane's revenge. It was time to face the past to protect the future of Emma and their new family. Crane's mansion was bathed in a soft light when Peter and Megan arrived the next evening. They had left Emma with Peter's housekeeper after gently explaining that they had to take care of important business for their future together. When Crane opened the door, his face went from a pleasant smile to an expression of pure terror upon seeing Peter. The man stammered words of surprise as Peter told him in an icy voice that they needed to talk about his daughter, Emma. Crane led them into his mansion's living room, decorated with luxurious furniture, likely bought with the money stolen from Peter. When Peter revealed that Emma was alive and that he had found her, Crane's face contorted in panic. The man collapsed into an armchair, his head in his hands. Under pressure, Crane confessed everything. When Peter had fired and reported him, he had lost everything: his wife, his children, his reputation. He wanted Peter to feel the same pain. He had engineered the identity swap, the fake documents, and the placement of the child with Megan and Mark. Megan shot back that Emma was just an innocent child, asking how he could have used her for his revenge. Crane explained that he thought she would be better off away from Peter, that he never wanted to harm her, only to make Peter suffer. Peter approached Crane, anger rising within him. He told him he had stolen 5 years of his daughter's life, 5 years he had spent crying over an empty grave while she grew up believing she was an orphan. Crane admitted he regretted it every day. When he saw how devastated Peter was, he realized he had gone too far, but by then it was too late to turn back. Peter took out his phone and showed Crane he was recording their conversation. He told him he had just confessed to everything: kidnapping, forgery, corruption, and that he would spend the rest of his days in prison. But before calling the police, Peter wanted to tell him one thing. His revenge had failed because instead of destroying his family, it had created something even more beautiful. Emma had had a wonderful mother who loved her like her own daughter, and now there were 3 of them, a family stronger than it ever would have been. He explained that Megan and Emma would live with him, that Emma would have the biological father she deserved, and the mother who had raised her with love. Crane had tried to break a family, but he had created a new one. 3 months later, the Reed estate was transformed. Megan had agreed to live there as an extended family, and gradually she and Peter discovered they had much more in common than they ever imagined. It wasn't a romantic love, at least not yet, but a mix of respect, affection, and a shared devotion to Emma. Emma, for her part, had accepted the situation with the simplicity of a child. Peter was her biological daddy, and Megan was her mommy from the heart. To her, it was perfectly normal. Crane was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison for his crimes. Before being incarcerated, he wrote a letter to Peter asking for forgiveness and thanking him for not seeking physical revenge. One spring evening, as Emma played in the garden, Peter and Megan sat on the terrace, watching the sunset. He thought about what would have happened if Megan had never shown up at his door that night. Peter would have remained a bitter man, hating the world, and Megan would still be homeless, with a child to raise alone. Fate worked in mysterious ways. Sometimes the most beautiful things are born from the most painful situations. Megan started to say something about their future, then blushed and stopped. Peter looked at her with tenderness, telling her he didn't know what the future held, but he had immense respect for her and that Emma adored her. As for the rest, they would see with time. Emma ran towards them, her blonde hair shining in the sun, calling for both of them to come play with her. Peter and Megan exchanged a smile. This child called them both by names that symbolized love, not biology. They stood up and ran into the garden where Emma was waiting for them, arms wide open. A family born from pain, which had grown in hope and was solidified in the purest love, the love for a child who had brought 2 broken hearts together and helped them heal. The story of Peter, Megan, and Emma showed that sometimes second chances come disguised as tragedy, and that love can truly blossom from the most unlikely circumstances. If this story touched your heart and made you believe in the strength of family love, give it a like and share. Peter, Megan, and Emma prove that families are built not just on blood ties, but on love, dedication, and the will to fight together. Subscribe to discover more stories that celebrate the power of second chances and show that love can be born even from the most difficult situations. Turn on notifications. Remember, sometimes the people we least expect become the most important in our lives. Never underestimate the power of fate and the importance of opening your heart to unexpected possibilities.